Last time we spoke about the Emo Uprising. Empress Min royally messed up when she allowed her nephew, Min Gomo, to be in charge of handling out the grain to the retired soldiers. His tossing of the job to a subordinate led to embezzlement, and the soldiers were greatly slighted. The very pissed off soldiers began a major riot threatening to kill Empress Min, her clan, and those who thought they had cheated them. The Japanese military advisor and other staff were attacked, and some Japanese were even killed, thus bringing Japan into the mix. King Gojong panicked and he allowed his father to return, only to be ousted by said father. Now the Dawogun was back and he immediately went to work trying to rid Korea of the Min clan. Now the Chinese and Japanese were bringing forces to bear in Korea. Was war on the menu? This episode is the Gapsin Coup. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've just now finished up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. And just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there you can find exclusive content, including podcasts. The latest exclusive podcast is on General Kanji Ishiwaru, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. So if that's of interest to you, go check out the Patreon. It would mean a lot to me. The Chinese had a very sticky situation on their hands. The attempted coup d'etat had disposed many officials who they had been working with, and worse, they had attacked Japanese nationals, prompting Japan to perform military intervention. Ma Jingzong ordered the Dawogun to meet with him, and he read him the Riot Act. Ma accused him of acting against the Qing Emperor by unseating the approved King of Korea. In his words, "Your sin is unpardonable. Considering the fact that you are the father of the king, we will not press hard on you. Please go to Tianjin and receive whatever punishment is bestowed upon you." The Dawogun was then forced into a palanquin, whisked aboard the warship Wei Yuan, and he was sent to Tianjin. He was then interrogated by Li Hangzhang, who sent him into house arrest at Baojing until October of 1885. Li Hangzhang had this to say of it all. "Our country regarded Korea as part of the empire and dispatched troops. We arrested the evil ringleader, the Dawogun, and detained him at Baojing. The Korean masses were awed. Now the entire world knows that Korea is our dependency." Basically, Li Hangzhang was playing a grand game of power politics. He was trying to show face to the Western world that China was indeed in charge of Korea. However, this major show of face was also a large loss of face, particularly to Korea and Japan, who saw this as quite the lenient strategy. And thus, China reasserted her suzerainty over Korea. Her troops secured Seoul, and the Qing officials began to aid the Korean-Japanese negotiations. The Treaty of Turmoil was signed on August 30th of 1882, to which Korea agreed to pay Japan in indemnities, sent an envoy to officially apologize, and permitted a Japanese legation guard force to be in Seoul. The Qing began training the Korean army and provided them with 1,000 rifles, 2 cannons, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The Korean military was to be trained by a Qing figure, one of the most important figures in modern Chinese history, called Yuan Shikai. And oh boy, the history behind this guy. Over on my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, I think I have made at least 8 episodes related to him. But he is going to come up a bit further on in the story, and as a lead player. I can assure you, after finishing my entire multi-part series on China's warlord era, which was created by this guy single-handedly, he is definitely someone to, keep an eye on. Korea was reduced to an official tributary state of the Qing, with King Gojong unable to make any more decisions without official Qing approval prior. China basically began to treat Korea like its own little colony. The Min clan came right back into their seats of power, albeit under Qing approval, and Li Hangzhang began to perform some puppetry work on the nation to make sure that she served Qing interests. The Korean government then received 2 major advisors, Ma Jianzhong, and a close confidant to Li Hangzhang, Paul von Mollendorf, formerly of the German Foreign Office, but now under Li Hangzhang's personal employment. The new capital guard commander was Yuan Shikai. By 1883, Li Hangzhang was so pleased with his work, he said this to an American minister in Beijing. "I am the King of Korea. Whenever I think the interests of China require me to assert the prerogative." The 1880s were a political maelstrom for Korea. As a result of the actions of the Qing and Japanese, Korea was literally being torn apart. 2 major factions emerged within the Korean political scene, the first being the Gawa Party, known also as the Enlightenment Party. They can be seen as a leftist party, progressive liberal types. Their leadership came mostly from the Yangban class, those being the traditional gentry ruling class of the Joseon dynasty. These were the highly educated types who joined the bureaucracy and military, the quote-unquote landed guys, the aristocrats. They were much akin to the Qing officials, those who took examinations to earn their place within the government, living by the principles of Confucianism. The members of this faction included Kim Ok-kyun, who spent considerable time in Japan and was mentored by Fukuzawa Yukichi. Kim Ok-kyun was to emerge as the leader of this faction, and he alongside his colleagues pushed for a more independent Korea that took steps to perform their own version of the Meiji Restoration. They also wanted to end what they saw as Qing interference with their nation. They were greatly frustrated by the limited scale and scope of Korea's modernization efforts and reforms. Most of their leadership, like Kim Ok-kyun, were quite young, in their late 20s and early 30s. They were headstrong, to be progressive, and progressive at this time, to them, looked a lot like Japan. They basically saw the Qing as an arrogant imperialistic power interfering with their nation rather than being her protector. The other faction was known as the Sadedang, the right-side conservatives. This included the Min clan and many high government officials who were very pro-Qing. It's not to say they were against the progressives or progress for that matter. In fact, they championed many causes put forward by the Enlightenment Party, but they favored gradual changes based on a Qing model. After the Imo uprising, the pro-Chinese faction was greatly bolstered, obviously because of the interventions by the Qing within their nation. The Min clan advocated going about the modernization process via Dongdo Seoge, adopting Western technology while keeping Eastern values. It was not so different from the Meiji Restoration, but they wanted to keep in line with the Chinese. In 1882, after getting rid of the Daewongun and his rioters, the Min clan pursued a pro-Chinese policy. Instead of adopting major institutional reforms akin to the Meiji Restoration, such as legal equality, modern education, and significant industrialization, they chose to direct the pathway of the nation's reforms in piecemeal efforts. This basically meant revamping the underlying social structure of Korea rather than replacing or changing it. They began to block all appointments of progressives to any important positions, particularly that of their greatest rival, Kim Ok-kyun. They signed trade agreements with the Qing that enabled the Qing to dominate trade with Korea at the expense of other nations, specifically that of Japan. Kingo Jung basically looked like he was abandoning all the progressive policies that had begun before the emo uprising. The Japanese were livid over all of this, as they had planned to dominate Korea with their influence, to soon import Korean grain and export products back. But now China dominated her. Then a major event occurred that drew conflict between Japan and China over Korea yet again. In 1880, Kim Ok-kyun had managed to secure a position in the High Government Office, serving as a counselor in the Foreign Office, and even became acquainted with King Gojong. He was the bulwark trying to get Korea to take the Meiji Restoration's path. And in December of 1881, he went off to Japan and would be in Japan when the emo uprising occurred. Since he was there, he was made the official Korean representative in 1882 to apologize for the ordeal, and he would remain in Japan until 1884. While in Japan, he was influenced heavily by Fukuzawa Yukichi. Through this, Kim Ok-kyun became convinced Korea needed to be severed from its Qing domination by overthrowing the Min clan, so that they could commence a Meiji Restoration type program with Japan's help. In Kim Ok-kyun's words, Korea is a country in which misgovernment and extortion have flourished luxuriantly for centuries, but under the recent Ming administration, a serious change for the worse has taken place. Now in 1884, hostilities broke out between the Qing and the French over a conflict in Annam. This became known as the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885. And literally as I am recording this for you, I have been writing my ass off about that event. So that event, I think I can concretely say now, is about 5 episodes long. I certainly fell down a rabbit hole trying to cover it. It was an event I didn't know very well myself. And I guess just to give you a little bit of a teaser, just before we get to the last episode that explains the situation in Korea, that series on the Sino-French War, that will come out. So it might get a little bit jarring. We're going to be bouncing from Korea over to, well, what is kind of modern-day Vietnam, and then we'll come back to Korea. Anyways, needless to say, the Qing forces within Korea were moved to deal with the French, and this represented a major opportunity for the progressives in Korea. Despite the name progressive, the pro-Japanese faction decided to fall back on, quote, the old Korean method of political transformation by murder. Yes, they were going to attempt another coup d'etat, with help from the Japanese. The Gawa leadership on December the 4th staged their coup under the guise of a grand banquet being hosted by Hong Young-sik, the director of the Ujeon Chongguk, the postal administration. It was an inaugural banquet to celebrate the opening of the new National Post Office. The guests were to be Kingo Jung, the commanders of the Seoul garrison, several foreign diplomats and high-ranking officials, obviously many of which were members of the Sadang faction. They had a little bit of help from the Japanese minister, Takseo Shinichiro, who promised he would mobilize the Japanese legation guards to provide assistance. The plan was quite simple: get everyone to come and kill the commanders and officials. Then they would hijack King Gojong and use him like a puppet to legitimize their pro-Japanese reform program. Hell, they even had a 14-point proposal which held conditions such as these: to end Korea's tributary relationship to the Qing dynasty, to abolish the Yangbang privileges and establish equal rights for all, to reorganize the governmental structure as a constitutional monarchy, to change the land tax laws, to cancel the grain loan system, unify the internal fiscal administrations, promote free commerce and trade, create a modern police system, who would in turn severely punish corrupt officials in government, i.e. the Min clan, mind you. And these were quite good reforms, to be honest. Now, Kim Ok-kyun was obviously encouraged by Fukuzawa Yukichi, alongside other Japanese intellectuals and officials who were pushing him to seek a Meiji-style reform in Korea. But the Japanese leaders did not support his plans for a coup. Count Iwakura, the same man who led the Iwakura mission, and the foreign minister, Inoue Karu, both refused to support the coup, as they still wanted to retain goodwill with China. Shibusawa Iichi, the most prominent Japanese business leader in promoting Japanese business in other parts of Asia, also refused to support the coup. Kim Ok-kyun had presented many in Japan his plans, but with 3,000 Chinese troops in Korea, he knew the coup had basically no chance. That was until the Sino-French War had broken out. So despite not having any real support from Japan, he went ahead with the coup thinking it was an opportunity too great to pass up. And so they began the banquet, and Kim Ok-kyun sent some of his supporters to set fire to a nearby building, causing some noise and confusion. While that occurred, they seized King Gojong and brought him to his palace. They then began to summon various Korean garrison commanders they believed might mobilize the military against them to the palace. Each commander came in one by one, only to be murdered by the Gawa Party. So basically, the coup amounted to the decapitation of 6 Korean ministers, the murder of military officials and other administrators, while occupying the royal palace, backed up by the Japanese legation force of around 170 men. The father of the murdered postmaster general, who had been duped into hosting the event, was so appalled by everything later on, feeling such a stain upon his family's honor, he invited all 18 members of his family to dinner one night, and he killed them all alongside himself via poisoning. Holy shit. Now things didn't go according to plan for the Gawa Party. The Japanese minister Takezoe went back on his promise to provide military assistance as soon as word came that the Qing were sending forces into the city. Kim Ok-kyun seemed to believe with just under 200 Japanese troops, he was going to somehow maintain power, keeping the king hostage. But 1,500 Qing troops were not going to let that happen. When the coup was found out, Queen Min secretly sent word to the Qing asking for help. And so they sent General Yuan Shikai. It took Yuan Shikai and his men all but 3 days to retake the palace, rout the Japanese troops, and rescue Kingo Jung. During the fighting, around 180 people were killed, including 38 Japanese troops and 10 Chinese troops. The officials who had been appointed by Kim Ok-kyun were all dismissed. Japanese citizens living in Seoul were now viewed by the locals as exploiters, and thus they became the targets of further attack. Many of their homes were looted and burned. Kim Ok-kyun and 8 of his followers managed to escape over to Japan using a Japanese ship. Just prior to the failed coup, Kim Ok-kyun had met with Kingo Jung about some reform ideas, and the king was in support of many of them. After the coup, the king made a full 180 and publicly labeled Kim Ok-kyun as a villain. Kingo Jung voided all the reform measures done by the coup leaders and sent an envoy to Japan to protest their involvement in the coup, demanding reparation for the conspiracy. On December the 6th, Kingo Jung telegraphed Li Hangzhang asking for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Yuan Shikai had wanted to dethrone the king because he deemed the king, quote, to be a dim-witted monarch, who he believed was actually complicit in the coup and was actually being overruled by the conspirators. He may have not been wrong about that assessment, by the way. A sticky political situation thus emerged between the 3 nations. As I had mentioned, King Gojong demanded Japan reparate the conspirators. The Japanese responded by demanding Korea pay them an indemnity for the loss of life and property, to make a formal apology and a promise to punish the guilty. In a show of force, the Japanese sent 7 warships and 2 battalions straight to Korea. On January the 9th of 1885, within the presence of 600 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers, and under the threat of war, if they did not cooperate, Korea signed the Seoul Protocol, also known as the Treaty of Hangsong. The Koreans officially apologized, and they paid Japan reparations in the sum of 100,000 yen for damages done to the Japanese legation. Go figure that. This treaty, however, was really gimmicky, because the real trouble going on was not between Japan and Korea, but instead between Japan and China. Ito Hirobumi and Li Hangzhang met in Tianjin in April of 1885 to discuss the matter. Tensions were very high between the nations, and both men tried to diffuse that tension. They called for bilateral troop withdrawal from Korea, a proscription against sending further military instructors, and prior notification to another of any future troop deployments in Korea. Kingo Jung would be advised to hire military instructors from a third nation to train up the Joseon army. America was the most likely candidate. Japan and China signed off on this, and it became known as the Tianjin Convention, or Li-Ito Convention. It was a diplomatic victory for Japan in the end. The Japanese minister Takaseo Shinichiro avoided punishment for his complicity in the coup, which essentially was done to subvert Korea's tributary status to the Qing. China had lost her exclusive claim to be the armed intervention in Korea, since Japan and her now were on an even front. The treaty represented yet again another curtailment of Qing's suzerainty over Korea. Now, despite all of that, Japan had also lost significant influence over Korea, while China's influence only increased. Japan looked like the bad guy to the Korean populace. Also, Li Hangzhang appointed Yuan Shikai as the, quote, Director General Resident in Korea of Diplomatic and Commercial Relations. Basically, Yuan Shikai was to look after Qing interests in Korea, but in a civilian capacity. Officially, this was in line with the Tianjin Convention, as Yuan Shikai was no longer a military leader. But both China and Japan knew at a hair's notice Yuan Shikai could call upon the Qing forces whenever he wanted. Li Hangzhang instructed Yuan Shikai to prevent Japanese commercial dominance over Korea and to promote Chinese commercial dominance, which he did very well. After both the Chinese and Japanese withdrew their forces from Korea, as per the Tianjin Convention, China chose to garrison most of its forces along the Korean border. Likewise, the vast majority of telegraph lines in Korea were Chinese-controlled, while Japan had one going to Busan. But when they requested it be extended to Seoul, this was rejected. Thus, the Japanese could only communicate with Seoul using Chinese-controlled telegraph systems. Yuan Shikai, despite being in his early 20s, exercised strong leadership, and for all intents and purposes, Japanese influence would simply be drained. Now, while many Koreans were happy to be rid of Kim Ok-kyun and his Japanese thugs, many also complained about Yuan Shikai, who was seen to be a very overbearing and quite arrogant man towards the Korean government and her people. In June of 1885, China signed the final peace protocol with France, and thus for the first time since the Russian conflict in Xinjiang, China was free of threat from war with Russia and France. This gave the Qing government the opportunity to be finally more aggressive in Korea. Yuan Shikai operated as if he were above the law. He replaced progressive officials with pro-Chinese members of the Min clan. He also began interposing in foreign matters, taking the place of Korean diplomats or envoys. He stopped all attempts at military reform and the development of modern industry. As for his personal reputation, that was quite bad as well. He acquired a reputation, as one source put it, for kidnapping young Korean women and making them his concubines, something akin to a 19th century comfort woman situation. Yes, Yuan Shikai was a complete asshole. And boy, oh boy, would he remain being one in Chinese history. And so the Qing and Min clan were using the two failed coups to virtually wipe out all of their political opposition. Yuan Shikai's tenure over Korea, which lasted for a decade, has been considered by some historians as a dark age for Korea's development. Japan had learnt a lesson after 1884 bitterly, and they would not ensue in Korea for quite some time. But this did not mean forever. No, the lesson they learnt was not to leave Korea alone. It was that they should make sure to have a stronger position than China next time. Kingo Jung had also learned a lesson, that Korea was very vulnerable and needed a protector. But who? Well, King Gojong secretly began gravitating towards Russia. You know, the Russian Empire was quite a coy player when it came to Asia, and China in particular. The Qing had greatly miscalculated when it came to Russia in the 19th century. The Qing intelligence indicated to them that the Russians had crushed Britain and France during the Crimean War, so when the Second Opium War was raging on, China was quite afraid of Russia. This had a large effect on the Qing, as they basically gave up parts of Siberia to Russia, assuming they had large forces at the ready, when in fact the Far Eastern forces were scattered around horribly. Had the Qing showed a stronger arm against Russia early on, they could have retained more territory, which would have helped them pay their large indemnities to the West after the Opium Wars. From the Russian point of view, they took full advantage of a golden situation. Honestly, imagine Britain and France fought a war against this grand Qing Empire in the late 1850s, and Russia just barges in, making demands alongside them. With the Treaty of Akin, setting a new boundary on the Amur River, Russia gained 185,000 square miles of territory. That is the size of California, and it was the only livable parts of eastern Siberia. Russia followed this up with the Treaty of Peking, grabbing 130,000 more square miles of territory. Then again on October the 7th of 1864, where they signed the Treaty of Tarbaghati, grabbing another 350,000 square miles. That was like adding 2 Italys to your country. The Qing at the time did not have proper knowledge of that said territory. And after handing it over, and upon figuring out that it was all just a bluff, they were humiliated. Russia had acquired all of this through a bluff, with just some bravado and a brilliant stroke of diplomacy. And yes, this was all part of a greater event known as the Great Game. Russia and China were in conflict for a long time because of Xinjiang province. They remained on the verge of full-scale war until 1881, when they signed a treaty. But until that point, China had felt hamstrung when it came to Korea and the Russians. As the Korean situation went further and further to shit, the Russians eagerly watched, salivating, as you can imagine. Russia's strategy for quite a long time at this point was to surround its empire with weak neighbors, to destabilize those who might threaten to become too strong. This was a very logical strategy for a large continental power. Thus, Russia wanted to do everything possible to stop a third power from swallowing up and revitalizing Korea. They sent Karl Ivanovich Weber as consul to Korea, and he carefully cultivated ties with King Jung. Weber made it clear to the Korean officials Russia intended to support them in the event of Korean territorial integrity or independence, if it became threatened, that is. A secret deal was made between Korea and Russia to obtain military instructors in return for the lease of Yonghonghang, a port in Wonsan. When the British found out about this, they were quite livid, and they immediately occupied Komodo Island near the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. It's not important just yet, but Britain and Russia began to become very aggressive towards another with their holdings in East Asia, and it would rear its ugly head in 1904. When Yuan Shikai found out about Kingo Jung's plans to secure the Russian military assistance, he was not too happy, and he tried to intimidate them. Yuan Shikai ended up quashing the Russian military advisor's plan by leaking it to the diplomatic community, which caused quite a large uproar. What a dick. Yuan Shikai's influence over Korea was beginning to boomerang, however, as now the Korean populace sought Russian aid even more so, having seen Qing's suzerainty being so overbearing. King Gojong approached Weber again in 1886 requesting to establish a Russian protectorship. This was, however, leaked to Yuan Shikai, who began plans to depose of the king, but Li Hangzhang overruled him before he could do so. Russia would make 2 fateful decisions. The first in 1888, when they would try to facilitate Japan's attempts to undermine the Qing influence over Korea. Russia did this in order to weaken the Anglo-Chinese relations, but Russia had also greatly underestimated Japanese power and overestimated the Qing power. The second decision I have spoken about multiple times, the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway. This decision altered the balance of power in the Far East, as Russia would be able to deploy troops at basically a whim's notice to the Qing or Korean borders. But Russia also needed something else vitally important, a warm water port. Russia had acquired Vladivostok, a cold water port that freezes up for a few months of the year. But back then, without icebreakers, one could not keep their fleet at port year-round. And thus, Russia eyed Korea, or a Chinese warm water port in the Yellow Sea, as a future prize that they must claim at all cost. That fateful decision would lead to a catastrophic war in 1904. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I have a 2-part series on the First Sino-Japanese War. So if you want a bit of a teaser of what's about to come, go over there and check it out. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there, you can check out my exclusive podcast on General Kanji Ishiwara, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The Gapsin Coup was yet again another mess that almost led China and Japan to war over their proxy fight over Korea. Things were heating up more and more. How long could the diplomats and politicians hold it all off?